Hello, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Thanks for joining for our marine forecast. Starting off with a quick look at our ice edge, we do have some open water pushing up into the Chukchi Sea area, and then we have some areas of ice extending from the Kotzebue Sound area up to the northwest coast and along the Arctic coastline. Taking a look at our weather for Friday to get an idea of what's going on with our maritime forecast, we have high pressure out over the Aleutian Islands. This is going to keep rain showers away from most of the maritime areas out for the Aleutians and Bering. And we'll have flow moving around the high pressure, so we expect some northerly winds along the west coast. But with high pressure, we generally see some weaker winds there and some weaker northerly winds along the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. Out into the Gulf of Alaska area, we have a low south of Kodiak Island that's bringing some rain showers all along the Gulf coastline down into the Panhandle as well, out ahead of this front moving in. Out ahead of the front, we'll see some southeasterly winds for the Panhandle area and some easterly winds out for the northern Gulf. And then up along the Arctic coastline, we have high pressure far up to the north that's going to bring some weaker easterly winds along the Arctic coast. Then into Saturday, pretty similar story up north. We have high pressure staying up over the Arctic Ocean with a low pressure system out by the Brooks Range, bringing in some weaker easterly flow to the Arctic coast. Down in the Gulf, we have low out over the Gulf of Alaska. That's going to continue to bring some southeasterly winds to the Panhandle area, as well as some rain throughout the Panhandle. Rain extending up the Gulf coastline into south central Alaska, and we'll see some easterly winds out ahead of that as well. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, our high pressure is moving off to the east, but we'll still see some northerly winds along the west coast down through the Alaska Peninsula. Some more variable winds out over the eastern or central Aleutian Islands. And then out by the western Aleutian Islands, we'll start to see some stronger winds pick up as this next system moves in, bringing rain back to the western Aleutians as well as some southerly winds. Zooming in on southeast for Friday, we will see some easterly winds 10 to 20 knots in the inside waters, getting up higher in the southern locations. Out over the Gulf waters, 15 to 20 knots out of a southeasterly direction, dropping down as we get closer towards Yakutat. Then on Saturday, continuing to see those southeast winds, but picking up in speed a little bit here. Central and northern areas, around 15 knots. Down in southern areas, up to as high as 25 knots. 25 knots out over the southern portions of the eastern Gulf, with seas getting up to as high as 7 feet out by Craig, and then dropping down to 15 to 20 knots out of an easterly direction as we approach Yakutat. For south central Alaska, easterly winds in the northern portions of the Gulf, 20 knots in the western locations, and then around 15 knots as we get into those more northeastern locations. Up in the Prince William Sound area, variable winds around 10 knots, and then out over the Cook Inlet area, northerly winds 10 knots there, picking up to 20 knots on the western side of the Barren Islands. On Saturday, 10 knots all throughout the Cook Inlet corridor down by the Barren Islands area. Easterly winds out of the northern portion of the Gulf of Alaska, 15 to 20 knots there, and then 10 knots in Prince William Sound area. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting around Kodiak Island, northeasterly winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest through Shelikof Strait with 7-foot seas there. For the Alaska Peninsula, northerly winds expected weaker on the Bering side, only around 10 knots, getting up to 20 knots on the Pacific side. For Saturday, starting again around Kodiak Island there, northeasterly winds 10 to 15 knots. And out for the Alaska Peninsula area, starting to become more westerly, around 20 knots on the Bering side, and northwesterly, 15 to 20 knots on the Pacific side. For Friday for the Aleutians, primarily northerly winds for the central and eastern Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots there. But out by the western Aleutian Islands, underneath that high pressure, more variable wind directions, around 15 knots. Then on Saturday, we'll see that next system coming up, southerly winds getting up to 20 to 25 knots for the western Aleutian Islands. For the central Aleutian Islands, 15 knots out of a southerly direction, becoming more westerly as we get to the eastern side of that high pressure. That's going to be around 20 knots by the eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast of the state, we're going to see predominantly northwesterly winds 20 to 25 knots north of Nunavik Island, and then dropping down to 10 to 15 knots as we get south of Nunavik Island. Out by St. Matthew Island, westerly winds 20 knots, and out by St. Paul and St. George, northwesterly winds 15 knots expected. On Saturday, flow along the west coast becoming much more westerly, 15 knots all along the coastline. Out by St. Matthew Island, southwesterly winds 20 knots, and out by the Pribilofs, southwest winds 15 knots expected. Up along the Arctic coast, weaker easterly winds, 5 to 10 knots for the most part, picking up to 15 knots as we get closer towards Kaktovik, and then down the west coast, northerly winds 15 to 20 knots. For Saturday, still seeing those light easterly winds, 5 to 10 knots along the Arctic coastline, and then becoming more southerly, 10 to 15 knots as we get closer towards the Bering Strait. Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for watching.